Last time we spoke about Ishiwara Kanji. Born in 1889, Ishiwara Kanji was the son of a policeman from a samurai lineage. He entered military training at the age of 13, rising through the ranks to become a major and a respected lecturer. His unconventional views on military strategy and history led him to predict a prolonged conflict with the United States was looming. Deeply influenced by Nichiren Buddhism, he envisioned Japan as the moral leader destined to guide Asia, advocating for reform in China while grappling with his nation's imperial ambitions. By 1928, Ishiwara fell ill with influenza, leading to a 6-month hospitalization. During his recovery, he joined an elite study group discussing war theory. His lectures on total war gained fame, culminating in a presentation to the Kwantung officers. Amidst rising tensions in Japan, he advocated for control over Manchuria, believing Japan had a moral duty to stabilize China. His theories on warfare included the devastating potential of air power, foreshadowing the horrors of future conflicts influencing Japan's military strategies. This episode is Ishiwara Kanji Part 2, the Mukden Incident. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more, so give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and my newly titled podcast, Echoes of War, found on all major podcast platforms. If you're further interested in Ishiwara Kanji, over on both, I have a 4-part series covering his entire life. If you'd like to further support me, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Joining either gets you access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. For the next 2.5 years, Ishiwara and Itagaki collaborated with other members of the Kwantung Army to address what they perceived as the Manchurian issue. By the mid-1930s, the belief that Manchuria needed to be forcibly seized had become the prevailing opinion amongst the Kwantung Army. Ishiwara was convinced that Japan could no longer remain passive in Manchuria, as each passing day meant Japan was gradually losing its rights and interests in the region of China, risking expulsion. Abandoning Manchuria would be a national catastrophe, resulting in the loss of a crucial buffer state, valuable resources, and land for Japan's growing population to settle. In essence, Manchuria was vital for Japan's survival and her growth. Ishiwara would often say, "Manchuria provides Japan with breathing space." And where have we heard that type of talk before? To the military heads in Tokyo, Ishiwara would often assert Manchuria had to be seized via force because of the Soviet threat and communism as a whole. In view of the traditional Russian policy in that area, once the Soviets advanced into Manchuria, it would become a base for the communization of Asia. Not only would the internal stability of Manchuria become impossible to maintain, but Japan would be unable to maintain its own national defense, and China's defenses, too, would become imperialized. The Army headquarters in Tokyo also recognized that Manchuria was a crucial defensive line against the USSR. However, unlike the Kwantung Army, which aimed to control all of Manchuria, the leaders in Tokyo focused on incorporating southern Manchuria through the South Manchurian Railway, and did not pursue any territory north of it. Ishiwara, on the other hand, believed that the only way for Japan to prevent the USSR from exerting pressure on southern Manchuria was, of course, to occupy northern Manchuria, and extend even further north towards the Amur River. This would allow Japan to control the mountain ranges that bordered the western and eastern frontiers of northern Manchuria. Once Japan controlled northern Manchuria, Ishiwara stated in 1931, "With the solution of our defensive problems in the north, we would then be free to plan an advance in any direction, to China proper, for example, or even to Southeast Asia." Ishiwara advanced his ideas significantly after Japan's conquest of Manchuria, recognizing the necessity of effectively administering and pacifying its diverse populations. He posited that the stability of Manchuria could be achieved through the unique skills and contributions of various ethnic groups residing there. For instance, he believed that the Chinese would excel in developing small businesses, while the Koreans would apply their expertise in paddy farming. These racial dynamics, according to Ishiwara, would play a crucial role in the development of Manchukuo and the broader vision of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. However, what was clear, above all, Manchuria was intended to serve Japan's interests, many of which were exploitative and economically driven. By early 1930, Ishiwara and his colleague Itagaki devised a military strategy reminiscent of tactics employed during the Russo-Japanese War, specifically a surprise night attack. Their plan involved the Kwantung Army launching an assault on the Liaoning region, targeting key Chinese garrisons. This operation required meticulous planning, as the Kwantung Army was significantly outnumbered by the forces commanded by Zhang Shuliang. Within the vicinity of Mukden alone, Zhang Shuliang commanded approximately 20,000 well-equipped troops, supported by aircraft and tanks. Across Manchuria, he could mobilize around 250,000 possible soldiers in the event of a conflict. Now, in stark contrast, the Kwantung Army could field about 10,000 personnel, primarily composed of garrison units stationed along the railway. They lacked substantial air support and mechanized units, and overall equipment was inadequate. To address this stark imbalance in military strength, Ishiwara emphasized the importance of intelligence and rigorous training. He aimed to refine specific assault techniques, enabling Japanese forces to execute rapid and concentrated attacks that would overwhelm their Chinese adversaries. The overarching strategy was notably straightforward. It hinged on delivering a decisive blow to the heart of Zhang Shuliang's military stronghold, which was at the Peitaying barracks in Mukden. Ishiwara believed that this critical target, if it were to fall, it would shatter the enemy's morale, providing the Kwantung Army with the necessary military and psychological momentum to dominate the surrounding regions. However, he acknowledged that if the Soviet Union intervened, the entire plan would unravel catastrophically. One important variable Ishiwara highlighted was the necessity to pull off the operation before any attempt to restructure the domestic order in Japan occurred. Ishiwara knew his arguments and those of his colleagues would influence the heads in Tokyo, and that they had to act before they did. However, the heads at Tokyo and the Kwantung Army held very different perspectives on when to act. In June of 1931, the Central Army HQ stated in its general outline of the solution to the Manchurian problem, "We must defer the question of military action for a whole year. During this time, the Foreign Ministry would attempt to dampen anti-Japanese activities in Manchuria through negotiation with the government of Nanjing. In the meantime, the government would launch an information campaign to try and drive acquiescence at home and abroad for military action." Ishiwara, as you can imagine, was deeply frustrated by the prospect of delaying action for another year. He argued passionately that the current international landscape necessitated an immediate strike. At that time, the Soviet Union was still in the midst of its ambitious 5-year plan, which limited its capacity for intervention. Meanwhile, the United States, Britain, and France were grappling with their own financial crises, rendering them unable to mount significant resistance in the Far East. Most notably, the nationalist regime in China was preoccupied with its unification efforts south of the Great Wall, but this situation was expected to shift quite soon. Ishiwara believed that if they postponed their plans for a year, the geopolitical environment would deteriorate further, making decisive action imperative. For Ishiwara, the moment to act was now or never. In July of 1931, Ishiwara and Itagaki orchestrated a crucial reconnaissance mission aimed at familiarizing the newest Kwantung officers with the northern regions of Manchuria. To disguise their true intentions, they informed High Command that the mission was a survey focused on the Soviet Union. However, their real objective was to assess the strength and influence of Chinese power in northern Manchuria. During their return journey, the team received alarming news about the disappearance of one Captain Nakamura Shintaro, a Kwantung Army officer. Upon reaching Port Arthur, they learned that rumors were circulating that Captain Nakamura had been killed by Chinese soldiers under what was described as mysterious circumstances. In the preceding months, Manchuria had witnessed a surge in violent riots, murders, work strikes, and various other incidents, all contributing to a climate of unrest. The Nakamura Affair, as it was being called, intensified these existing tensions. In response, both the Chinese and the Japanese foreign ministries attempted to negotiate a resolution to the crisis. However, figures at the Central Army headquarters, such as Nagata Tsetsusan, who sympathized with the urgency felt by their Kwantung counterparts, felt compelled to support them. The situation was rapidly escalating, and the stakes were growing even higher. For Ishiwara, the issue was clear, as he wrote then, The Nakamura incident adds just one more issue to the others. What the army should do now is to ignore the foreign ministry and solve the problem by taking matters into its own hands. And that's exactly what he did. The Kwantung Army officers moved their troops beyond the railway zone, where they had been confined, and without waiting for Itagi's approval, who was in Japan at the time, they began preparations to send an armored train along with a mixed regiment of infantry and artillery to Mukden. Their goal was to enlist the help of the Chinese military in investigating Nakamura's disappearance. Upon learning of this, Tokyo sent a telegram instructing them to halt their departure from the railway and to refrain from using the Nakamura incident as a pretext for employing force to address the Manchurian issue. For Ishiwara, this was the last straw. On August 20th, he sent a message to Nagata condemning the current diplomatic situation and stating that negotiations were an utter waste of time. There is no way to settle the matter except by placing it in the hands of the army. If Central HQ finds it so difficult to trust its field personnel, then it better replace them with representatives more suitable to the conditions it imagines exist in Manchuria. Ishiwara doubled down, and he pushed for a plot to provoke military conflict outside of Mukden. At this time, he wrote in almost Masonic Nichiren conviction, "I will be the pillar of Japan. I will be the eyes of Japan. I will be the great vessel of Japan." Gekkokujo, ruling from above. This is a Japanese historical term referring to when subordinates defy or manipulate their superiors. Ishiwara and his like-minded colleagues were about to perform Gekkujo. Ishiwara ordered the dispatch of an armored train carrying a mixed regiment of infantry and artillery to compel the Chinese military authorities in Mukden to assist in the investigation of Nakamura's disappearance. As we saw, however, Central Headquarters halted the train's departure at the very last minute, sending a telegram from Tokyo that specifically instructed the Kwantung Army not to use the Nakamura incident to pressure a resolution to what they were calling the Manchurian problem. Now, in addition to the Nakamura situation, another issue was brewing. Colonel Ishiwara Kanji was involved in a plot to enlist the warlord Yan Qishan to attack Zhang Shuliang. This scheme was attracting unwanted attention and undermined the effectiveness of the Nakamura incident, prompting Ishiwara to swiftly suppress the plans. Rumors began to circulate in Tokyo that the Kwantung Army was preparing to retaliate against the Chinese due to the Nakamura situation. In response, War Minister General Minami dispatched Major General Yoshiji Tatekawa to Mukden to caution the Kwantung Army officers against such actions. Ishiwara was informed of Tatekawa's arrival, and he sent urgent telegrams to his followers warning, "Plot exposed. Act before Tatekawa's arrival." Consequently, the launch date was moved to September the 18th. Itagaki personally intercepted Tatekawa's train, inviting him for tea and sake, and arranged for him to spend the night with a geisha on the evening of the 18th. On September the 18th of 1931, First Lieutenant Sumori Kawamoto of the Independent Garrison Unit of the 29th Infantry Regiment planted bombs along the tracks near Liaotauko. At 10:20 p.m., they exploded, doing only minor damage to about 1.5 meters of the track on the site. The damage was in fact so minor, a train actually passed over the tracks without difficulty 10 minutes later. Ishiwara, Itagaki, and their followers quickly announced the explosion to be a Chinese atrocity, and they mobilized the Kwantung Army. Itagaki ordered the independent garrison force and the 29th Infantry Regiment to storm the Peitaing barracks. Battalion Commander Shimamoto was awakened by orders via telephone, and he quickly dispatched the 1st Ono and 4th Takahashi companies from Mukden, the 2nd Kawakami Company of Fushen to advance to Liaotauko. At 10:40 p.m., the 29th Regiment Commander Hirata got a call from Shimamoto, who ordered him to get his regiment into emergency formation and to storm the Peitaing barracks. Two secretly hidden 24-centimeter artillery pieces began to bombard the Peitaing barracks as 500 Japanese stormed the 7,000-strong Chinese garrison there. Despite being outnumbered 14-1, the Japanese destroyed Zhang Shuliang's small air force, routed the Chinese forces there, and occupied the Peitaing barracks by 11 p.m., all at the cost of 500 Chinese lives and allegedly only 2 Japanese. Major reason the Japanese had ease was because Zhang Shuliang ordered his men to store away their weapons and not put up a fight if the Japanese invaded. Zhang Shuliang and Chiang Kai-shek, both in Beijing at the time, knew they could not initiate an offensive war against such a strong foreign country. They were both hoping the League of Nations would interfere, pertaining to the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928. But later on, Chiang Kai-shek would find America too wrapped up in its depression at home, Britain indifferent, and other nations without enough reason to risk anything at all in the Far East. An hour after the attack, Ishiwara began pressing General Shigeru Hanjo, the newly appointed commander-in-chief of the Kwantung Army, to send reinforcements to capture all of Mukden. Initially, Hanjo hesitated, but Ishiwara convinced him that there was significant provocation from the enemy, prompting Hanjo to order additional units into combat to secure the entire city. Now, historians have since struggled to determine whether Hanjo was aware of the invasion plan. It seems likely he had some knowledge, but not the full details, which made him cautious in his actions over the following weeks. In the days that followed, Hanjo attempted to confine the incident, but Ishiwara and Itagaki continuously urged all forces to adhere to the secret plan they had all trained for. The speed and decisiveness of these actions overwhelmed the Chinese forces and left Hanjo unable to change the course of events. Rather famously, when one colleague asked Itagaki what to do in response to a cease-and-desist order coming from Hanjo, Itagaki responded, "Never mind, Hanjo. It's Ishiwara's war." Official orders from Tokyo came on the very next day, specifically opposing the expansion of hostilities, but Ishiwara and Itagaki had come too far to stop now. They began persuading Hanjo to telegram the general staff to ask for reinforcements and freedom of action to, quote, pursue actively the security and order of all Manchuria. Ishiwara and Itagaki clearly aimed to expand their offensive through official channels first, but they also circumvented these channels. One cunning tactic they used was to incite chaos amongst civilians in Manchurian cities, thereby heightening the demand for improved security of their Japanese residents. This strategy would enable the Kwantung Army troops to move beyond their established boundaries. Shortly after what is known as the Mukden incident, military agents were sent to Kirin to stir unrest in the city. Reports of disturbances from Kirin began flooding into the Kwantung Army headquarters, with Ishiwara urging Hanjo to send forces to Kirin to safeguard Japanese residents. He also pushed for reinforcements from the Korean army, but Hanjo was reluctant to take that step. It seems Ishiwara feared missing a golden opportunity, and he chose another course of action. On the night of the 20th, he gathered together a bunch of younger Kwantung Army officers, such as Itagaki's assistant, Captain Katakura Tadashi, and he told them, "I can't do anything more to budge the commander, and so I'm giving up my responsibilities for the direction of operations. Katakura, you take over." Well, it seems this little ploy had the intended effect, as all of the young officers immediately began pressuring Hanjo to support Ishiwara's demands to advance to Kirin, many of them threatening to resign. After several hours of the officers nagging, Hanjo relented and he authorized the dispatch of troops. The operation against Kirin was executed with remarkable speed. Ishiwara ordered the majority of the 2nd Division, led by General Tamanjiro, to swiftly travel to Kirin by train. They entered the city without firing a single shot, and they compelled the local Chinese commander to declare the province independence from Zhang Shuliang's regime. Within mere hours, the Korean army responded to an aid request from the Kwantung Army staff sent on September the 21st, and they began advancing into Manchuria. Thus, in just 48 hours, the Japanese military had taken control of Kirin, which was outside the Kwantung operational zone, and the Korean army was now invading Manchuria without Tokyo's approval, effectively undermining military discipline. Chief of Staff Kanaya Hanzo had issued specific orders to restrict the Kwantung Army's operations, and he granted field commanders discretionary authority for certain emergency situations, typically at a local nature. However, the Kirin expedition did not fit within these parameters. Encouraged by their success, Ishiwara and Itagaki pushed for an advance on Harbin. As I've already stated, the strategy for taking Manchuria relied on speed and precision. The Kwantung Army had limited forces compared to the immediate Chinese troops in Manchuria, yet they were constrained by directives from Tokyo HQ that prohibited the movement of Kwantung troops beyond the South Manchurian Railway Zone, where they had previously confined their actions. Ishiwara attempted to frame the situation politically, arguing that Japan should support Manchurian independence and send this proposal directly to Tokyo Central HQ. However, on October the 3rd, Tokyo HQ firmly rejected the idea of expanding hostilities. Faced with this outright refusal from Tokyo HQ, the Kwantung radicals believed their only option was to create further chaos to compel a response. Ishiwara took the lead once more, aiming to unsettle Tokyo HQ. On October the 8th, he donned military pilot gear, and he infiltrated one of the 5 Chinese aircraft seized at the Mukden airfield. He personally led a raid, although later in life, during the Tokyo war crime trials, he would claim that the flight was intended solely for reconnaissance of enemy activities at Jinzhou. He argued that it was only at the last moment that intelligence revealed anti-aircraft guns had been installed at Jinzhou, prompting the Kwantung Army commander to authorize their neutralization if fired upon. Ishiwara maintained that he and the other 4 accompanying aircraft were indeed fired upon, leading them to drop approximately 75 bombs on Jinzhou. Yes, you can call this bullshit. This series of events was quite dramatic, and contemporary accounts suggest it was a premeditated effort to provoke Tokyo, which it definitely was. The raid on Jinzhou certainly alarmed Tokyo, leading the staff there to worry that the West would start condemning them. Tokyo's high command found themselves in a difficult position. They felt compelled to publicly support the Kwantung Army by retroactively approving the chaotic attacks, but internally they were furious. Major Endo Saburo from the Intelligence Division was dispatched to Manchuria to investigate the situation. When he asked Ishiwara about the events, Ishiwara claimed he had acted on the principle of field initiative, which was why he hadn't informed Tokyo beforehand. Saburo also noted Ishiwara's tone suggests that he and the Intelligence Division should stay out of the matter. Additionally, Saburo learned that there were whispers in Manchuria indicating that if Tokyo's high command did not align with them, the Kwantung Army was ready to act independently. It appeared that the radical officers of the Kwantung Army were even willing to defy the Imperial Japanese Army command to achieve their goals. Ishiwara went as far as to send a telegram to Tokyo stating, "For the sake of the nation, we are doing our very best in Manchuria. But if the Japanese government constantly interferes, we cannot complete our great work. Then the Kwantung Army will come to a point where we will have to break the glorious history of the Imperial Army and separate ourselves from the Empire." If you find the situation quite surprising, there was also a rumor that Ishiwara and Itagaki planned to use an independent Manchuria as a base for a coup d'etat against the Japanese government. Their goal was to overthrow the capitalists oppressing the people of Japan and establish a National Socialist regime centered around the emperor. For those familiar with the history of the political assassinations in 1930s Japan, this rumor hints at the events that would unfold in 1936. It remains unclear whether Ishiwara and Itagaki genuinely intended to pursue this plan, but they certainly spread the word. On October the 18th, War Minister Minamijiro sent a telegram to the Kwantung Army instructing them to stop any discussions about making Manchuria independent or attempting to seize control of it. Additionally, they dispatched Colonel Imamura Hideyoshi from the operations section to Manchuria to reason with Ishiwara and Itagaki. They all met at a restaurant in Mukden where Imamura began explaining the purpose of his mission, but before he could even really begin, Ishiwara blurted out, "What's the matter? Doesn't Central Headquarters have any backbone?" It was a great way to start the meeting, to be sure. Imamura tried to explain the situation, but Ishiwara said, "If we follow the spineless Tokyo approach, we'll never settle the Manchurian problem." To this, Imamura replied, "We can't accomplish anything by following the arbitrary decision of field elements, which may create a crisis that will shake the whole army. In such a problem, it is essential for the whole nation to be unified." To this, Ishiwara apparently said really loud in the restaurant that he was sleepy, he rolled over on a tatami, and he closed his eyes. Imamura was furious, and no shit. He got up quickly after denouncing his so-called hosts for conducting official IJ business at a public restaurant, and then he left. The next day, they all met again, where Ishiwara and Itagaki kept speaking about the necessity to create an independent state, since there was no hope of the Chinese reforming Manchuria by themselves. After Imamura left the meeting, Ishiwara said to Itagaki, "Imamura is a fine fellow, but he doesn't understand China." Despite the chaos and turmoil, the Kwantung Army had been held back from launching any sustained military operations throughout October. As expected, Ishiwara continued to argue for an advance into Northern Manchuria. In early November, he found another opportunity when he claimed that more railways had been destroyed. Allegedly hostile Chinese forces had blown up the rail bridges over the Nani River, south of Qiqihar. When Japanese engineering units arrived to repair the damaged tracks, they came under fire from Chinese troops. To the high-ranking officials in Tokyo, this appeared to be a legitimate reason to take a defensive action. Additionally, Kwantung intelligence reports were reaching Tokyo, suggesting that Chinese forces in Northern Manchuria were planning a southward offensive. Ishiwara had also provided exaggerated reports to the Chinese public, manipulating media narratives to pressure Tokyo into supporting an advance into Northern Manchuria. By the way, I think I'll just take a sidestep here to explain something. For the next few episodes, I'm going to be covering all of these actions independently. Thus, this part of the story goes into the future a bit, but it's taking the perspective of Ishiwara. Don't you worry, we will be covering every little offensive that goes on. So Tokyo approved a defensive operation, restricted in time and scope, aimed at protecting Japanese positions at the Noni River bridges. Kwantung Army forces began moving north, and soon they engaged in intense fighting around the railway area at Taoxing. Ishiwara personally led the troops during this engagement, marking the only time in his military career that he would do so. General Honjo, rightly concerned that the Kwantung forces were becoming uncontrollable, sent a cable on November the 5th announcing that, under the Rinsan Inmai, provisional mandate, the general staff would assume direct command authority in Manchuria. Unsurprisingly, Ishiwara and his like-minded colleagues in the Kwantung Army were furious. Honjo followed this up by stating he would resign if they did not comply, but Ishiwara brushed off the provisional mandate, stating that the directive from the Chief of Staff is just a personal, not an imperial order. No matter how many we get of those, we shouldn't care. We'll just go ahead with our plans. On November the 17th, the Kwantung Army began advancing upon the city of Qiqihar, seizing it 2 days later. Confronted with yet another dire situation, the IJ High Command permitted the Kwantung Army to advance towards Qiqihar. However, international outcry soon erupted, compelling them to order the evacuation of the city. Ishiwara sparked a significant debate amongst the staff, arguing that the evacuation was unacceptable, given the sacrifices made by the troops. Nevertheless, Honjo remained resolute. A few days later, Chinese forces began to gather at Jinzhou, and tensions escalated with skirmishes occurring between Japanese and Chinese troops in Tianjin. In response, Ishiwara urgently called for Honjo to initiate an offensive at Jinzhou as a way to better position their forces closer to Tianjin, in case they faced overwhelming opposition. To support this advance, they also requested assistance from the Korean Army. Once again, the burden fell to Tokyo. The High Command in Tokyo ordered an immediate halt to the offensive and withdrawal east of the Liao River. The Kwantung Army hesitated, not solely due to the order, but also because the Korean Army refused to join the offensive against Jinzhou, which was crucial for their success. Ishiwara found himself in a predicament. Without reinforcements, the entire offensive could fail. Then on December the 11th, a significant change occurred when Premier Wakatsuki was ousted. War Minister Minami and the Chief of Staff Kanaya, who had attempted to moderate the Kwantung Army's aggressiveness, were replaced by Araki Sadio, the leader of the Koda faction, known for its aggressive stance. Now, to provide some context, the Japanese military was divided into factions, similar to warlord cliques, I guess you could say, vying to influence the future operations of the Imperial Japanese Army and, to a lesser extent, the Navy. Two primary factions shaped the military landscape in the 1930s, the Kodaha faction, which means the Imperial Way faction, and the Tosaha faction, which means the Control faction. The Kodaha faction was not an organized political party, nor did it hold any official position within the IGA, but it wielded considerable influence. Its members were typically younger officers, particularly from the Kwantung Army. General Sadio Araki was a founding member of the Kodaha faction, which was heavily influenced by Bushido, fascism, and the Kokutai ideology. They aimed to restore Japan to its perceived former glory, viewing liberal democracy as a detrimental force. They blamed the capitalists, the industrialists, and the elites, those politicians, bureaucrats, and the Zaibatsu leaders, for the nation's decline. Their goal was to see the emperor reclaim full power in what they termed a Showa restoration. The Koda's primary adversary, as perceived by much of the Japanese military at the time, was the USSR, and communism in general. Consequently, they supported the Hokushinran doctrine. This was the Northern Strike policy, which was Japan's theoretical plan to invade the USSR. By the way, I have to say, it's a very interesting episode if you want to go listen to it, but over on my Patreon account or my YouTube membership, I made an alternate history episode dedicated to what if the Hokushinran strategy was actually implemented. And this was not me just spitballing. I really did a lot of research, I found the unit numbers, and I really tried to give an accurate look at how stupid it would have been, to be honest, because it would have been stupid if the Japanese went through with it. It makes for a very fun episode. And actually, I'll just say it here, I have been thinking about doing a very extensive project looking into an alternate history series on what if World War II went different for Japan, if they made different choices. I don't want to say how would Japan win World War II, because under no circumstances is that really possible, but perhaps they could have negotiated a peace. Maybe they could have done something. And if I do create this series, it'll probably begin on my Patreon and YouTube membership. So again, if you're interested, you can go check it out. Now, I don't want to delve too deeply into the details, but it's important to note that the Kodaha faction was counterbalanced by the more moderate Tosai faction led by Hideki Tojo. The Tosai faction opposed the Kodaha on several fronts, notably their desire to avoid a violent revolution to restore imperial dominance. But they did share many principles. The Tosai rejected the Hokushinran strategy in favor of the Nanshinran strategy, that is, the Southern Strike Doctrine, which aimed to expand into Southeast Asia and the resource-rich Dutch East Indies. The Tosai faction also maintained better relations with the Imperial Japanese Navy. To contextualize this narrative within the political landscape, these two factions began to fiercely compete for dominance starting in about 1931. With the influence of Araki Sadio and support from Prince Kanyin, a Kodaha sympathizer, significant changes occurred in Tokyo's command. Suddenly, offensive operations against Chinese forces in Manchuria were rebranded as bandit suppression campaigns. The Kwantung Army, fully backed by Tokyo, swiftly pursued all military objectives established by Ishiwara and Itagaki since September. Jinzhou and Chanhaguan were captured in early January of 1932, followed by Tizihar in February. In spring of 1932, Ishiwara urged the staff to complete the full occupation of Manchuria, both north and south. In April of that year, he presented the Manchu Haitu Hiryaku, or the Program for the Pacification of Manchuria. This new plan called for the seizure of Halar in the north because, quote, it was pivotal to the defense against the USSR. It also called for seizing Johor province, which at the time was called Ruhe province, because it was an important condition to the independence of Manchuria. By the end of the year, Halar was taken, and in 1933, the Kwantung Army was marching upon Jeoul. If you're interested in the invasion of Jeoul, which was known as the invasion of Ruhe at the time, I actually have an episode of that on my YouTube channel. It is clear that Ishiwara played a crucial role in the conquest of Manchuria. The Kwantung Army and the Imperial Japanese Army had various strategies available to address the Manchurian issue, but Ishiwara focused primarily on achieving complete control over the region for its resources, strategic advantages, and to establish a continental base for a potential war against the United States. For Ishiwara, securing all of Manchuria was essential in preparation for the final war. While it's likely that conflict between Japan and China would have occurred in Manchuria without Ishiwara's influence, it's uncertain whether Japan would have outright taken the province. Ishiwara dedicated years to planning and pushing boundaries, but when the operation commenced, it became evident that he and his associates lacked a definitive timetable for conquest and had several missing contingency plans. Despite the chaotic circumstances, the conquest of Manchuria proved to be a remarkable success. So much so, Ishiwara said to a friend of his at the time, Saitome Kishio, in 1932, "Even if Japan has to face the entire world, she can't be beaten." Ironically, as many of you know, Japan's actions in Manchuria cost her greatly. Japan was now hated by the Chinese. Well, I guess more so now. The West condemned Japan's actions alongside the USSR. As my professor first taught me in a class about the Pacific War, when I was but a wee lad in my early 20s, it was all about Manchuria. Everything started with Manchuria, and it ended with Manchuria in 1945. The Manchurian incident set Japan on an unavoidable path towards the China War, which ultimately led to a conflict with the West. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy. This situation also raised questions about military discipline. Many cite the concept of gikujo as a reason as to why individuals like Ishiwara and Itagaki were able to act the way they did. These militaristic junior officers seemed to be running rampant, engaging in rebellious actions that defied their superiors, which forced the higher-ups to become complicit. While gikujo certainly played a role, especially in Ishiwara's case, it did not negate the fact that there was a significant level of indiscipline within the Japanese army. Ishiwara was undoubtedly aware of the potential consequences of his actions. A prime example was Colonel Kimoto Daisuke, who had previously seen his career ruined after being exiled due to the Hankutuen incident. However, Ishiwara's focus extended beyond Manchuria. He was closely monitoring the political landscape in Tokyo. He recognized that the 1931 cabinet was unstable and that certain high-ranking officials like Araki Sario were rapidly advancing in their careers and they sympathized with his agenda. Ishiwara was betting that supporters from factions like the Koda faction would gain the necessary power to further his cause. His gamble paid off handsomely, as all the key players in the Manchurian affair were rewarded for their efforts. Ishiwara received the Order of the Golden Kite, 3rd class, and he returned to Japan as a celebrated hero, captivating younger officers in the Imperial Japanese Army. And rather ironically, the indiscipline he had nurtured within the army would later come back to haunt him, as he climbed the ranks and became part of the Tokyo staff. And again, this is where we're going to end our story about Ishiwara Kanji. But if you are interested, because honestly, the future of Ishiwara Kanji is very bizarre. For example, he's going to spend the rest of his career trying to stop a war with China, ironically enough, and he would be the rival to Hideki Tojo. There are 2 other episodes on my YouTube channel if you want to listen over there, or you can check out my podcast at Echoes of War to finish the story. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and my newly titled podcast, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. Over on both of these, you can find a 4-part series covering the life of Ishiwara Kanji. So there is a lot more to the story if you're interested. If you'd like to further support me, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Joining either gets you access to the exclusive podcast, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. The polls are actually about to go up, and like I mentioned in the episode, I might do an exclusive series on an alternate history of what if Japan did better during World War II. So if that's interesting to you, go check it out. As Ron Burgundy once said, "Boy, that escalated quickly. I mean, that really got out of hand fast." Well, perhaps Ishiwara did not plan for an all-out war to break out against China, but he certainly was the culprit to making it happen. There was no going back. 15 years of blood, sweat, and tears would be shed by the Japanese and Chinese people.